Hello AWS friends, and welcome to this new video and tutorial about AWS CodeCatalyst. CodeCatalyst is a new service from AWS which is still in development and only yet available in the region US West 2 to kind of replace these services you might know from the developer tools in AWS. Here you find, for example, code commit, repository, code artifact, code build, where you can actually build or test your projects, code deploy, to deploy your applications to various resources like Fargate services or Elastic Beanstalk apps or even S3, and code pipeline to create pipelines for the whole deployment process, building the project, deploying the project, testing the project. CodeCatalyst will going to provide kind of all of these functionality, and there's also the purpose to get rid of the toolchain account you used to need with these traditional developer tools. When deploying a software to your stage accounts, for example, you might have a account dev, a QA account, and a prod account. You would need also a toolchain account where you would deploy your code pipeline, either created with CDK or manually here in the web console. And from this code pipeline, or even a job from code build, you will then deploy your resources in your 3 or whatever 4 stage accounts. With CodeCatalyst, this will be no longer required. So let's get started and switch in AWS to CodeCatalyst. Here on the UI you don't have much functionality because, as mentioned, your pipelines or your Git repository is not here actually in this account. The only thing you're going to create is a space. Before we get started now, maybe also to mention, you will find here in my GitHub repository, as always, a sample project for this example of what we're going to do, and you will also find some more informations, of course, in the AWS documentation on CodeCatalyst. And also important to mention, before you get started with CodeCatalyst, you have to create this AWS Builder ID. Please have a look on the documentation how to set up. It's pretty easy, but you're gonna need it to continue here on AWS CodeCatalyst. Your AWS IAM user is not gonna be sufficient to continue. So when you get your builder's ID, you need to create a space for CodeCatalyst, and that's, as mentioned, actually the only thing interesting here in the traditional web console. Also important, you will need a IAM role for CodeCatalyst. I have assigned here 2 actually. You will find also example for this role in my repo, and also more information on the documentation on AWS. That's the only actual 2 entities you're gonna kind of maintain here in the AWS account, the role and the space. Once you got a space, you can start here by this button and open the CodeCatalyst UI. In this new CodeCatalyst UI, you have here the menu to switch between your spaces, and for each space you can create various projects where you can switch over here under this menu. For the spaces, important to mention, as you can see, I got here 3. 2 I created on my own, and another one I was invited to. So when you go to your space settings, you can see here you have the connected AWS accounts billing, your environments, the extensions, for example, extensions to connect to GitHub, and you have here these the menu for members, where you can, for example, add or invite other users to your space, and therefore work together in your project and in your space with you. Let's have a look a little bit deeper on what we got here as features. Once you have created a project, so we're going to do this in a second, you will find here this overview where you can see in the README basically there's a nice little architecture diagram of your solutions. You have some informations on the roles we just saw here in the old AWS console where you have to create and connect. So please have a look here for your roles and for your policies. And you have here information on the workflows which you have created or not yet, pull requests from the source repository, and so on. So here there's also an interesting feature which is new, which we didn't have so far in the DevTools. You have a kind of a Scrum board where you can create issues and move them here in this on this Scrum board. You have the section code, which is in DevTools kind of code commit. You have repositories. You can create here your own repository, or you can link a repository. For example, I have linked here a GitHub repository. So if you link repositories, you can see here only available yet is GitHub and Jira. So you have to install these extensions, but as you can see, you will only find this here yet. Here in source repositories you will also find pull requests, and there's also a link to your dev environment, which we also have here actually in CI/CD, where the most important section here is workflows, which is kind of the pipelines you used to know from code pipeline. And here you can edit with a YAML file your builds, add actions, and we're gonna see this a little bit later when we edit and create a workflow for our new project. You got environments, you can connect them with your Visual Studio, for example, or with your Cloud9 environment, and we're gonna open them in a second. You have these settings here on compute, you can add secrets and so on. You have a section for your test reports. I have not yet created ones, and you have general or project settings. Now let's create our project, a new project. So let's press this button. We have these options to start with a blueprint. We're going to do this. That's the most easy approach for now for a quick start. You have the chance to bring your own code. So if you have, for example, GitHub repos already connected, you would be able to select them here and start from there. Or if you want to start from the very beginning and code everything on your own, go this way with start from scratch. But as a beginner, please go for the blueprint option. Let's select, for example, a RESTful microservice with Lambda API Gateway and Dynamo. We say next. We're gonna call it a REST app. You have to select your account key. You have here the chance to select the roles you have defined there in your web console. You can select the language for the Lambda function. I'm going to select Python, and you have here some additional settings. The name for the repo. Also, let's not call it to do. Let's call it REST backend stack. And this section as a region, I'm gonna keep US West 2 since CodeCatalyst is in this phase only available there. We're gonna keep the dev environment in the same region for now. So create project. It's gonna be really quick, and we can have a look in the created project. So by now, here you go, REST app, and you can see here the source repositories, our project. We have a dev environment. Not yet, we're going to create these in a second, but here in CI/CD you have already kind of a template for a workflow, for a pipeline, which we're going to have to adapt. We have here environments to deploy, so this is going to be, for example, default, which is going to be point to our dev account, or we would be able for example, create a second environment, production, again link it with the account, and so on. So I'm going to say create dev environment. You can see here you can add, for example, a Cloud9 environment with a Studio Code, or for JetBrains I'm going to use Visual Studio, and we're gonna use our repo in here, the one we just have created. We're gonna work in our existing branch. We have only the main branch yet. We can add an alias, for example, it's optional, and we have here these settings, and I can now say create. And by now, as you can see, Visual Studio is going to open. Once our environment was created, you will be able to see it here in your IDE. So for my case, that's Visual Studio. What you should do is to, anyway, for your local installation, to have a look on your accounts, is to install the AWS toolkit here as an extension, and then you can see here in developer tools, CodeCatalyst is also extension for CDK. For Code Whisperer, you can see another video and tutorial about Code Whisperer in my channel. But for here you have the chance to open an environment, and then you can type here your environment. In my case, I have got already 4. These 3 are stopped by now, but this one, the REST app, is the one we just created. And by now here you can see the environment and the files of the repo. Let's see what we got here. We got an app Python here in our project. So obviously this is gonna be a CDK project. As we can see, this is our stack name we have entered. And yeah, here in Python you can see the Python stack where our CDK resources going to be created. A Dynamo table, got only one index ID, so you can start actually here to adapt your project. For example, here we got the name of the table is to do, so it's, for example, not a nice name for your entities to do. You can adapt it to your whatever entity you want to add here. We have lambdas here, lambda handlers for get to do's, for get one to do, for add to do, post method, delete method, and update also method. So we got a little bit more. We got test actually here, integration unit test, and so on. Really cool. All these was created. If you take a look in the README, you will find besides the architecture diagram some commands which you can execute here. So if you want to start your virtual environment here, I already started it actually, so you can follow this command. So by now it was deactivated. So you can, for example, install the requirements for your CDK project. You can run here also some tests. So the project is pretty cool, already ready to deploy a Dynamo, 5 lambdas, and API gateway, running tests. So let's go back to our environment and see if our project is also compiling by the workflow and deploying is going to be deployed to our environment. Let's go back to CodeCatalyst and have a look to the workflow, to the pipeline. So this is the pipeline which has been created, and as we can see, this is our workflow. There's a bootstrap action for CDK in case of no CDK action has been performed so far in the account. There's the backend deployment and the tests, and here the CDK deployment. So actually we should be able to see here some CloudFormation stacks deployed by CDK. This is a toolkit, this is the bootstrap stack, and this is our REST backend stack as we have named it. We can see the resources. So we have a DB or Dynamo, we have 5 lambdas, and we have an API gateway. Let's confirm this. Yes, we got our lambda actions, we got an API gateway. We can have a look if we can test it. For example, let's try the get method, get all method. And it's returning. I have already entered here a first entry. You can do this here on the post method. Just enter your body here. I think the only field by now, by the lambda definition, is a field title which you have to add. And then you can enter, and once you can get them also, of course, by ID and get or delete or update these. The workflow or the pipeline is defined by a YAML file. As you can see on here, you find descriptions on this YAML file here in the documentation for CodeCatalyst, and you have here some examples. This is the CDK deploy actions. As you can see, here's an example for the bootstrap, which is running in front of the deploy, and you can see here other examples for S3 publish, lambda invoke, or GitHub action, or whatever. So back to our code, we can see here basically the bootstrap action, and here the CDK deploy, our workflow source, and some informations on the account and so on. So far it's looking quite good, everything working, the resources have been deployed, our pipeline will run successfully. So please continue and create your first project and try out this new service. You find also a blog from my site here, how to get started with CodeCatalyst, with a little bit more explanation here in words. It's in my AWS blog, where you also find other examples on CDK or other stuff, Code Whisperer, which you might already know. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and you will start to try out a little bit CodeCatalyst and have fun creating your project and deploying your resources. See you on the next video.